Well, it's time now for Scoop, our weekly conversation on international media. We look at who shapes a narrative and explore journalistic ethics. With trust in the press at a nadir, it's a critical eye on a critical profession. Many of Donald Trump's attacks on the media are absurd, but his anger against a BBC documentary might be justified. The U.S. president even threatened a $1 billion lawsuit. Now, 1 week before last November's presidential election, and BBC's Panorama aired an episode called Trump, A Second Chance. The project was made by an independent production company called October Films, and it's the editing that has sparked the controversy. From a speech on January 6, 2021, just before the Capitol riots, two unrelated remarks were taken and spliced together. Take a look.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
The Telegraph broke this story. It had obtained a whistleblower memo that claimed Panorama had completely misled viewers. Here is Deputy Editor Gordon Rayner.
It's true that a lot of people will still feel Trump's claims that in 2021 the election was stolen were entirely inappropriate and unbecoming of a figure in politics. But irrespective of your personal views on Trump, the question remains, how is a national broadcaster funded by taxpayers on the premise that it will provide impartial reporting allowed to splice together content in a way that one of its own advisors said materially misled viewers? But if members of its own editorial standards committee have no faith in the broadcaster, you have to ask, should we?
And it's that memo that has sparked a crisis. After it was made public on November 9th, the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, resigned. This is a man who had earned the nickname Teflon Tim for his ability to survive crisis after crisis. From a Gaza documentary whose child narrator was the son of a Hamas official to a row over impartiality sparked by comments made by sports presenter Gary Lineker and Bob Vyland's controversial performance at Glastonbury with chance of death to the IDF. Now, the chief executive of BBC News, this woman, Deborah Turness, also stepped down. The White House celebrated both of these resignations. It was a major headline on both sides of the Atlantic. Brits love the BBC. They also love to hate it. It's the only media organization in the UK funded by a compulsory license fee. The scandal has divided the press and the public along political lines. Here's Emily Maitlis, former BBC journalist and current co-host of the Newsagents podcast.
You now have the spectacle of the Telegraph thanking Donald Trump for picking up their work and celebrating their journalism. In what world is Donald Trump an arbiter of impartial, evidence-based reality? It is ridiculous. But right now, you have the newspapers gleefully celebrating the fact that Donald Trump has given them a big fat tick.
And why is this all important? The BBC is one of the world's biggest broadcasters, but just to compare its domestic influence with U.S. broadcasters, well, the percentage of adults that the BBC News reaches is nearly twice as many as either Fox or CNN in the U.S. Let's bring in our guest, Dr. Tom Mills, a senior lecturer in sociology from Aston University. He's also the author of the book, The BBC, The Myth of a Public Service. Tom, hello to you, and thank you for joining us. The BBC has since publicly and privately apologized to Donald Trump, but rejected his demands for compensation, and that apology came just hours after the Telegraph discovered a second similarly edited clip which had aired on BBC's program Newsnight back in 2022. Whether it's Panorama or Newsnight, shouldn't there be multiple levels of editorial checks along the way? How do these mistakes happen?
Yeah, there definitely should be. I mean, there's no doubt that these are some quite serious, editorial errors, and there is a sense that the BBC, for a while now, there's a level of sort of chaos and lack of control editorially. I don't mean necessarily in terms of like people at the very top like having sign off on programming, because I don't think that would be appropriate, but the classic kinds of checks and balances that were in place seems to have been eroded. I mean, there's different reasons for that, but one of them is that although the BBC still does have a very large share of the news media market, as you mentioned, its resources have declined over the last 15 years quite significantly. I think the other element is that there does seem to have been a sort of leadership here which has been a bit adrift and hasn't responded very effectively to political pressure. And I mean, actually, in defense of the BBC often.
Yeah, this internal memo, it was written by Michael Prescott. Before we get to who he is, can you tell us a little bit about what else this dossier accused the BBC of?
Yeah, so the coverage has focused on the Trump speech that you mentioned, and that's really been at the center of the row. But it was quite a long dossier. I mean, it's described as a note. It was published in full, as you mentioned, but actually it raised lots of issues which have been for a long time mobilized, particularly by the right-wing press, accusing the BBC of anti-Israel reporting, but also of misleading coverage of issues of racism and trans rights. So basically, I think this note needs to be understood in the context of a kind of a culture war in the UK, in which the BBC is seen by the right as this kind of like socially liberal institution, which is in some way like consciously or unconsciously hostile towards the right. I think the context of the note is important though, because although the author, it's not an internal BBC document actually. Like the author is a former member of the editorial advisory committee and what's called an independent advisor. So they were an outsider brought in by the BBC to provide advice, and then the note was a summary of issues which they felt that the BBC was failing on editorially that aligned very closely to the ongoing criticism of the BBC, which has been emerging from the right-wing press. And you mentioned the Telegraph, but also the Daily Mail is very influential.
Yeah, and Michael Prescott, he says he's independent. He says he has no political agenda. But if you do read that 19-page memo, one of the things he points out is that he didn't like the usage of the term election denier in the United States. And I think when you talk about the election being stolen, election denier is hardly a controversial term for people who refuse to accept those results.
It's very clear, like, where Michael Prescott's coming from politically. Obviously, he professes to be independent, but what he really mentions is affiliations to political parties. What we also know from the coverage was that Michael Prescott is friends with a member of the BBC board who was appointed by Boris Johnson, Robbie Gibb, who's been a very divisive figure at the BBC because he's seen as interfering with editorial policy and appointments. He's friends with Michael Prescott, who is a former Sunday Times journalist, so he also comes from the right-wing press. He now works in corporate communications. I mean, he's essentially a lobbyist. So that clearly, like the note, as it was described, is pushing a particular political agenda around the BBC, making a series of claims which are trying to support a basic narrative around what the BBC is. Now, I think it's important to say, like, specifically on the question of Israel-Palestine that like features in the note, that there have been scholarly studies of the BBC's reporting of Israel-Palestine. And in fact, like most of the good evidence suggests the bias is actually in the opposite direction. Right. So it's not that like the BBC doesn't report on harm that Israel does or atrocities that it commits in the occupied territories, but the Palestinian historical perspective tends to be more or less lost, and the context of Israel being an occupied power just doesn't really appear in BBC reporting. So to a lot of people, I think like the claims of bias that are being made, putting aside this question of like the selective editing of Trump's speech, will not ring true to, but the BBC is basically much more responsive to those voices that come from the right than come from other sources. I mean, including like from academia, but also obviously from the left.
Right, and all this attention, the scrutiny, even more intense because it's a public broadcaster.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not the only public broadcaster. I mean, Britain has a slightly strange like media landscape. So there are Channel 4 News is also a public organization, but its funding model is different. There are commercial broadcasters which are classified as public service broadcasters that are commercial but operate under a similar sort of regulatory environment, but they never get the same kind of heightened criticism that the BBC gets. Part of the reason for that is that the BBC's reach is much, much higher. I mean, it's much more significant than Channel 4 News, but also the BBC is much more vulnerable to this kind of pressure because in the end, the BBC is dependent on the government, not only for its source of revenue, the license fee, but also for the renewal of its charter, which is like the document which allows the BBC to operate basically, which is going to be renewed very soon. I mean, the current charter expires at the end of 2027. And then finally, the fact that governments have been able to appoint representatives to BBC boards. Now, sometimes that's done in a sort of, fairly impartial manner, but often governments have basically sought to appoint to the board people who are politically aligned with them. And that's happened in this case. That happened historically as well. I mean, there have been other examples of director generals being forced to resign through when they're in conflict with a combination of right-wing politicians and the press. But often the pressure is also coming internally. So it's not, this isn't the BBC versus the press or the BBC versus politicians. The division cuts through the BBC itself. And that's why Robbie Gibb is seen as being such a significant figure in the current row.
Right. And given that current climate, do you think it makes us call into speculation whether the BBC's charter will be renewed in 2027, or is that a foregone conclusion?
It's a foregone conclusion. The question is what? I mean, it would be so damaging to the British media landscape if the BBC suddenly ceased to exist. It would be an incredibly reckless act. Certainly, the current Labour government wouldn't be contemplating that. However, what goes in the BBC charter is the key question, right? What kind of remit does the BBC have? Because the pressure from the right has always been basically to strip down the BBC. They don't quite know what to do with it. And the reason for this is the BBC performs lots of functions. I mean, one of the things it does is it takes public money and then it goes to private production companies. So you mentioned earlier that Panorama is produced by an independent company. This has been a sort of ongoing process at the BBC where it becomes more commercialized, where basically it's commissioning its programming from independent production companies. But also outside of news and current affairs, like in culture, the BBC is a really important sort of cornerstone of the British culture and media system. So there's no question about the BBC being abolished, although often at the height of crises like this, people start to panic, what will become of the BBC and so on. The serious debate is around what role public media should play in the 21st century. And what there hasn't been enough of, actually, is discussion up to this point as to how the BBC should operate and who it should be accountable to. Because what the current crisis shows, I think, is that primarily the BBC is accountable to members of its board, which in turn are appointed by governments, but also to a quite narrow group of people in the press, which is owned by extremely rich people. I mean, oligarchs essentially, and concentrations of ownership in the press have only increased. So there's what the conversation I think we should be having is what does the BBC look like, right, in the 21st century? What sort of form should it take?
We're going to have to end on that question, Tom. I'm so sorry. We have to end on that question. I want to thank you, though. Dr. Tom Mills joining us from Aston University. That brings us to our quote of the week, and it comes from Marina Hyde's opinion piece in The Guardian. She said, quote, "More and more, the nature of high-profile public service is repelling the best and the brightest. That is a great tragedy of our age and the great opportunity for those who were never in it to serve the public in the first place." That's it for this edition of Scoop. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.